So I am going to start recording just so that we can share with a number of people that weren't able to make it. But welcome, everyone. On behalf of Lauren and myself, we're really glad that you came, and we're really glad to have this opportunity to kind of talk about a lot of our joint work that myself, Lauren, and other members of our team have been doing on modeling operations of sex trafficking networks. Lauren is an associate professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota. She has had significant experience working in the domain of sex trafficking, especially in and around Minneapolis and Minnesota. And I've been fortunate enough to be collaborating with her for the past 2 years. So we're going to start our presentation and see how it goes. I think it's the first time I've done a joint seminar, and it's the first time I've done a virtual seminar. So hopefully everything goes smoothly. But Lauren is going to kind of kick it off.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Hey, before I kick it off, for people who are maybe not from Clemson, do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what your role is at Clemson?
Sure. So I'm a professor of industrial engineering, and I do pretty much nothing but network optimization, network interdiction, with applications kind of in the public sector.
Awesome, thanks. I think that kicks it off because I think what you're going to hear in this presentation is that Tom and I come from very different backgrounds, from different fields, and our whole team comes from different backgrounds and different fields, but that is the strength of our work, is figuring out how to work together across these different fields and actually different sectors, because our project includes more than just academia. But this is what we're going to cover today. I'm going to do a little bit of background on sex trafficking. Tom and I'll talk a little bit about our research team. We'll talk a little bit about data collection methods, particularly case files, and the role of a survivor-centered advisory group in our project. Then Tom will talk about sort of a case study on disrupting recruitment, thinking about how our different methods come together. And then we'll conclude and talk about our future work. For those of you listening, we will take questions between sections just to kind of check how that's going. And Tom and I will kind of tag team monitoring the chat. So if you have questions as we go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will get to them as we go. All right, next slide. So as I said, we have a really big and amazing team across disciplines, and really the way we're working goes beyond interdisciplinary to this concept called transdisciplinary, which means we're not just working in silos alongside each other. We are learning each other's methods, learning each other's approaches, and really going kind of deep. So I just want to acknowledge our full team. So the pictures there are the PIs and co-PIs on the current project. We have a lot of research associates and students that work with us. They're listed here. And then we want to acknowledge our advisory committee and partners. So lots of different stakeholders coming together from different perspectives. Okay, next slide. So just a little bit of background. Our project really grows out of what we could call a substantial data problem in human trafficking research. Human trafficking is super complex. It's a complex social and criminal activity that's really hidden. It's underground, it's illegal, it's dangerous. And these make it really difficult to do research. There isn't just some great big data set out there that we could use to do kind of mathematical modeling. There's a lot of gaps in the research because of the nature of human trafficking. So when we think about making models, mathematical models, or even understanding the phenomenon, we really have to be creative about looking at lots of different sources and really bringing different sources together to kind of create a whole picture. The other thing that is very important is we also have to carefully build in the consequences of interdictions, or the consequences of modeling, into the OR models, the operations research models that we develop, because this is a real world problem. It's a human rights abuse. There's a lot of violence. The work we do could potentially have consequence in the real world, and we want to make sure that we are being ethical and that we're really thinking through all the steps of what it is that we're trying to do here. So here's a little bit about our project. So with funding from the National Science Foundation, we're really at what, we're at the tail end of what I would call sort of a pilot phase of us building the work. The first thing that we focused on was building a functional transdisciplinary team. And our team spent quite a lot of time and effort building this foundation because we think that building our team creates a springboard for us to be able to look at any number of topics. So we spent a lot of time on that. We've also looked at lots of data and worked as a team to identify unique operational structures of sex trafficking networks. So we're, again, trying to understand what are the things that are unique to these networks. The other big work that we've been doing is figuring out how do we translate qualitative data, because most of the data that's out there on this is qualitative data. How do we translate that data into the type of data that's necessary to populate operations research models? This was actually a very complex methodological challenge that we've spent a lot of time working through. The other thing that we've been very attentive to is verifying that our model assumptions are accurate. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the work has consequence. We want to make sure that what we're doing is accurate. We don't want to put information out in the academic sphere or in the public sphere that is not accurate, because that's going to potentially be harmful. The other thing that we've been doing is kind of what we've been calling a meta study of ourselves. So we've been trying to learn, how are we doing this project? How are we building a transdisciplinary team? And I'll just say, so this graphic here is a visual depiction of past research that our teams have done in Minnesota from qualitative research. And what I'm excited about in this partnership is that with the OR team and the kind of transdisciplinary work that we're doing, we could turn this visual depiction, we could really work to make these things more mathematically based. And with that comes a little bit of power, analytic power that we can put to some of this data. Do you want to add something, Tom?
I was just unmuting for the transition, but I think I'd add, I mean, Lauren had this picture in something that she did before we started working together. And for those of you who are OR in the audience, I mean, you can already start seeing a network underlying this in terms of where the arcs, the dashed arrow lines are going into, and then where they originated from as well. So the team kind of was thinking, I think, networks before they knew the OR term for networks.
So I just want to give a quick quote about what is transdisciplinarity, because this might be a new concept. Essentially, it's knowledge production through integration and collaboration in the pursuit of addressing complex societal challenges. One thing that I think is very common in transdisciplinary science, and it's prevalent in the literature, is that miscommunication is expected. It happens all the time. We speak the same language, but we mean different things by similar words. And I'll just give one example of a word that we didn't even know for, like, I don't know, Tom, wasn't it like the first almost a year and a half? We were using the word code, which for qualitative researchers has a very specific definition. And code is sort of like how we capture themes in qualitative data. And of course, I was familiar with the term coding and code as it's used in computer science and math, but it didn't even cross my mind that when Tom and the other operations researchers were saying code, they were meaning code, like writing code. So it was kind of it was an important revelation. But we've had many, many words and concepts along that line that taking time to build our team really helped us work through. So we have a shared language and we understand each other's methods better.
So, in thinking about kind of what we're trying to accomplish here, we are modeling something that is really kind of sensitive in nature. So I think from the OR perspective, I'm always kind of drawn to this quote. I mean, it's more from a person with a statistics background, but ultimately what it's saying is, not the models that we create cannot capture the complexities of the real world. And if we're not carefully kind of justifying how we built the model and what we've assumed by the models will not be useful. And a couple kind of extensions of this quote that our team has kind of thought about and talked about, even if a model is useful, anything we don't include in the model, we no longer control. So the types of consequences of the actions we are kind of suggesting with our model, they may actually have consequences that we did not intend to have. So we have to be really careful when we're thinking about what we didn't model, when we're dealing kind of with these sensitive applications. And then also, no matter how useful your model is, if you don't have data to populate them, they're never going to be able to run. So kind of the data problem is really important in this context as well. And I think, from what the OR side of things, the industrial engineering side of things, I think we have to make sure that we're humble in the sense that models can help address problems. They can't solve the problems. And they can only help if they're created in a responsible manner with domain experts like Lauren and Kelly and other people that are part of our team. And then ultimately, the context matters. So Lauren, do you want to kind of talk through the rest?
Sure. So one of the things that we've been learning as we've been working, particularly with our survivor-centered advisory group, is that the models that we're doing can never actually capture the fullness of the complexity of the lived experience of trafficking victims, survivor leaders, and other people who've been involved. And especially models don't really capture the level of violence that we know is there. And when we'll talk a little bit more about the data, but when we're looking at law enforcement data, the way these networks function, there's a lot of violence and a lot of obvious human rights abuses. And so the models don't capture that component, at least what we've been working on thus far, but that doesn't mean that we can't bring those elements into our understanding of what the network models are showing. The other thing is our aim, we're not doing this just to kind of stare at the problem. Our goal is really to better understand these networks in order to help with decision-making around disruptions. And we're particularly interested in disruptions that lead to displacement or dismantling of operations rather than just, I said the exact opposite. We're looking for disruptions rather than displacement. So we wanna find areas in the networks that action or intervention or doing something will actually cause that operation to stop functioning. And when I say stop functioning, what I mean is stop abusing and harming victims within that operation. Do you want to add anything else on this slide, Tom?
I think we've covered a lot of it. Maybe just one final conclusion kind of coming from the OR side of things is I don't think, at least from my perspective, I would not have been able to build and kind of the research in a way that kind of checks off all of these considerations without kind of going through the learning process to understand how social scientists kind of view these problems and work with this type of data. So I think that is a big takeaway for those of you who are interested in kind of the societal applications of OR, is to go across disciplines to create your models.
And I would say the type of research that I typically do and that we're doing in this project is community-based research and participatory action research. What that means is we really include, as leaders and thought leaders and experts, we include people with lived experience in the research process, not just as people we interview, but as people who help guide the actual project and help shape the questions. And we'll talk a little more about it, but really understanding how to use these models, our understanding has been intimately shaped by the survivor leaders who've been helping us at every step on this project, really helping us to know how the models can help and what are their limits. I think that's a very important aspect of the work that we're doing, including those voices. All right, so talk a little bit about data collection methods, and the case files, and a little bit more about our advisory group and kind of how they fit into this mix. So as I'm sure you're gathering, there is no source that has a complete picture of what's going on with human trafficking, other than the people who are involved. And even there, many of the people involved don't have the total picture of what's happening with the networks and operations. So we're using a mixed methods qualitative research guided by, as I mentioned, the survivor-centered advisory group. So we have several sources of data that we're bringing to bear on the issue, and in social science language, sometimes it's called triangulation, which means we look at these different sources, and it's kind of like a puzzle. We put them together and we find where there are gaps in one source. Are those gaps filled by another source? And sort of how do we piece these things together? So we're looking at the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has a Minnesota Human Trafficking Investigators Task Force. We are looking at comprehensive case files. That means kind of all of their work investigating sex trafficking in Minnesota. We're also looking at federally prosecuted and publicly available documents from those federal prosecutions. So thus far, we've looked at about 13 cases. We did some targeted interviews of experts, including survivor leaders, to help us fill gaps and build in assumptions that are coming from reality of what people are experiencing. And the other thing we did, our team at UROC, particularly with Christina Melander and Emily Singerhouse on the University of Minnesota team, we have done a lot of interviews over the last 10, 15 years. So we did a secondary analysis of our past interviews just to see what were people saying that could help us think about sex trafficking operations and networks. Okay, you can move to the next. So a big goal of our project, we're going to zero in on one of the goals that we discussed at the beginning, and that goal around translating qualitative data into data that's necessary to populate operations research models. And really what that means is taking this super complex material and kind of boiling it down to nodes and arcs within specific network types. The way we've been doing this, we iteratively created a code book and a coding process that really focuses on the law enforcement data for now. So what we did to do this is we had a very iterative process. We started with one very short piece of information that our whole team did. So Tom and Casey and the other operations researchers had to learn how to, a little crash course in qualitative coding. And we had to learn a little crash course in nodes and arcs. And then we all did this work together and built a little data set that helped us figure out how to even begin structuring it. Then we built iteratively with some bigger cases. And then Christina and Emily from our team went super deep dive with 2 comprehensive investigative case files from the Minnesota BCA. We brought in the survivor advisory group at every level to help us make sure that what we were doing made sense. And they made some pretty substantial substantive changes to how we were thinking about things along the way. So that's just a little bit about our process. Just again, highlighting the comprehensive case file analysis was really important for our team because it helped us figure out how do we process super large source of unstructured data. So the comprehensive case files have oftentimes more than 1,000 pages of stuff. And what's tricky about working with law enforcement data is that what the law enforcement officials are looking for is information to help them prosecute a crime. They're looking for what are called the elements of the crime. They're not looking to document the full scope of a network, right? They're not looking to understand all the kind of stuff. It's not a research project that they're doing. So their data is by nature incomplete. So it's But on the other hand, they have subpoena power and they get a lot of information that, you know, I wouldn't be able to obtain. So it's important data, but it's not the total picture. So we've been looking at these different types of networks as they are depicted in the law enforcement case files, looking at relationships, cyber communications, money. A big piece that came very strong from the Survivor-Centered Advisory Group is really understanding the interplay of drugs with drug networks within these, and also thinking about forced labor as part of a sex trafficking operation, and the ways that that labor trafficking within sex trafficking actually upholds some of the sex trafficking itself. And then the other big piece is, in order for this data to be discoverable and shareable to the operations researchers, we have to anonymize it, and we have to then bounce it off of all of these other sources. So it's a complex methodological challenge. You can go to the next slide. This picture just kind of gives you sort of a visual depiction of how we work. I'm not going to walk through all of it, but essentially what you're seeing here is we have the qualitative data collection, where we're essentially coding for nodes and arcs and network types and different other features. And then we sort of work to transform. That's the sort of way we transform the data. Then we give that data to the OR team, and then there's math that's built in, and then we get visualizations, and those visualizations help us then go back and check the qualitative side. And then ultimately, you know, we're working on developing dynamic models that can help us understand how interventions or disruptions will impact the networks. And that's kind of where our team is now in our development as a transdisciplinary team. So I'm gonna kick it over to Tom.
So just kind of wanted to walk through and talk a little bit about examples of what the output of this process looks like in terms of network data and maybe some of the limitations of what is out there, as well as having Lauren talk through how the advisory committee has really augmented our understanding of these networks. So this is an example output of one of the federal case files, and we have various types of tiers in terms of either the criminals, kind of objects or items, locations, and then kind of people are broken down by kind of what their activities are within the context of the federal case file. And like we've shown this kind of visualization to the advisory group, just to kind of see what they pick up on or what they kind of comment on. And they often are able, you know, they often kind of explain like there's clearly missing data. I mean, a simple example here is T1 at the top is the trafficker that was prosecuted in this case. And then B1 is the trafficker's bottom. And there's no connection between those two from the case in the case file, which clearly in a sex trafficking operation, there would be kind of a detailed connection because they're collaborating to essentially run the operation. So the advisory group really kind of can start pointing out from their experiences where the data doesn't make sense in terms of the output. We also can kind of start breaking up the network, and this is the relationship network. So it's simply, you know, connecting the nodes together. We're not talking about flows yet or anything like that. But we can view it kind of dynamically over time in terms of who's connecting to who or who's connecting to what over the course of the investigation or the case notes. And so here we can kind of see like early on things are sparser and then they kind of ramp up towards the third day that things were being, the victim was being trafficked. And this was a really, it was a unique example because everything happened over the course of about 10 days. So that's why it's kind of a shorter case. And then kind of maybe kick it back to Lauren in terms of how the advisory, maybe more details in terms of how the advisory group augments our knowledge of these networks.
Sure, and I want to do a time check, Tom. We're at 12:50, so we have about 25 minutes left. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, And I want to save time for all of the slides that you have at the end, to really dig deeper into sort of the math piece of this. So essentially, I think I've already said all this. The survivor leader advisory group is absolutely key for us to understand the assumptions that we're building in, the parameters. This slide just kind of gives you an overview. We meet monthly, and really what we do is show them what we're working on. So like Tom said, showing the visuals, showing the code book that our qualitative team uses, and the code book has terms and definitions. And so working through those things, we ask them questions, really, what is missing? Like, what are we not capturing? And what are some of the ethical issues involved in thinking about it the way we're doing it? We ask them to add complexity. And we ask a little bit about decision making, because the data that we're looking at is static. We don't know what kind of decisions people were making necessarily. So it's really about filling in gaps. And I just want to emphasize all of this is grounded in respect for their expertise and knowledge. So we can move to the next slide. So this is just an example. Christina, from our team who facilitates the group, asked them to kind of go through and draw some networks from their knowledge. And what we're seeing is, what I want you to notice in this is that there are people in here that are not in the model that Tom showed you from the federal case files. So they're showing, like, the booster is a person who steals things and sells them and brings that profit back to the operation. So technically it's not sex trafficking, but it's supporting the operations. And then this is another example of a drawing that just, again, shows the complexity. We could say a lot more about these, but in the interest of time, I think we can keep going.
And one thing to fill in, I mean, the data that we've seen from the federal case files, I emphasize they were only really just relationships. And what, if we're talking about kind of the traditional interdiction models, we need some level of operations over the network, whether it be max flow, shortest path, min cost, something like that. So we don't get a rich enough data to actually build out some of the networks with flows in them, like the drug network, the money network, et cetera. So what we're doing now is taking the output from the advisory group meetings and interviews to kind of try and construct and fill in those details in a systematic way. So hopefully within the next 4 to 6 months, we actually have code available that will generate kind of realistic sex trafficking networks. And then, in part of the verification process will be to show the output to the advisory group and see what we got wrong and kind of update it through that process as well.
Super quick before you move, I just want to add another piece about this triangulation. So Tom just gave you a really great example of triangulation using the interviews, using some of the data from the federal case files. The comprehensive BCA case files have tons of details about some of the networks of interest for our work. Whereas the federal case files really only had information about the relationship networks. So again, using these different pieces to kind of build the picture is really important for how our work is going.
And I guess, what I was going to say, I know we want to kind of get through everything, but the data piece is so important. I kind of wanted to maybe pause here if there are questions of things that we talked about today, up to now, before we kind of do a case study. I think it would be good to try and answer them before moving on.
I have a quick question. This is Sudeep Hegde from Clemson Industrial Engineering. A fascinating methodology and a rare example of a blended approach. So I know one of the goals is to understand, whether your network is going to be more realistic with feedback from stakeholders, but what might be some of the implications of making or representing these networks more realistically in terms of helping with either prevention or investigation?
I think one important thing from the OR perspective is just from like contributing to the OR research. I mean, this is a really good application, but some of the data we have is so small that there's not a lot to do. Like, you could almost do some of the network modeling by hand with the small amount of data. We're at the process, kind of an interesting part, because with the BCA data that Lauren has referred to, she and her team have seen it, but just due to the data sharing agreements, no one outside of Minnesota has yet seen it. So we don't know if that has, I mean, Lauren said there's a lot there. So we'll kind of right on the cusp of understanding if that has enough detail where actually you would need models to do some of the understanding of the networks.
I'll just add, the data that we've been looking at thus far that Tom and the OR team have modeled in our spreadsheets, there's maybe a couple hundred rows. From the comprehensive BCA data, there's thousands of rows. So it's an order of magnitude more data. Now, I don't know if order of magnitude, I'm saying that to math people, that might be a wrong phrase, but it's much bigger. I don't know if it's going to be enough for what Tom needs to do, but that's part of what's exciting about our work, is we do this stuff and then we try it and then we figure out, okay, did that work? Is it what we needed? And then we retool and go a different direction. But Sudeep, to get to another point of what I think your question was asking, there are many, many questions in the field that are very hard to answer because we aren't able to model what the outcomes will be. So the case study that we're about to talk about is recruitment, and the need to disrupt recruitment of victims into trafficking operations. Like, that's sort of, on the face of it, obvious. You'd want to deter people from getting recruited, right? But where and how? Like, what's the intervention that has the most impact on the operation itself? Because there are many interventions that are currently being done, which are critical, rescuing victims. I would never say to stop doing that. But is that the intervention that's going to take down the whole operation? Probably not. And so the case study that we're looking at is, okay, so then what do we do? So it'll give information. And the reason that the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the partners, are working with us is because there's promise in our work to put new information in front of people so they can make decisions. We're not going to tell people what to do. I think Tom's point at the beginning about being very humble about the limitations of our work is critical. But this is a new view, a new way to look at it. It'll give new information to people for making decisions. Does that get to that kind of where you're going, Sudeep?
No, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
Were there any other questions?
All right, then.
Should we keep going?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so I'm going to go over this really quick. There's a lot of information here. So what Tom and I want to do now is just give this, like we said, this sort of case study. This visual is from a previous project from 2014, where we looked at police case files from Minneapolis and pulled out information to develop visual depictions models. Again, there's no math involved here, but what this visual is showing is a very complicated kind of how recruitment happens, and the people and the words in there as sort of factors that kind of create vulnerabilities to recruitment. And it's also showing different tactics that we found in law enforcement documents. So this lover boy pimps, that's what it was called in the documents, but that's essentially manipulating, alternating love and violence. Peer recruiting is kind of, we know that there are ways in which peers bring their peers into operations. Some is at the behest of a trafficker and some is unintentional. And then we saw, again, speaking to this issue around violence, we saw a lot of tactics around rape and gang rape, or multiple perpetrator rape, as a way of recruitment. And not depicted in this diagram is sort of the role of family involvement, neighborhood context, and the sort of informal market of sex trading and how that overlaps with formal trafficking operations. You can go to the next one. And when we think about, it's like if we step back and think about the sort of business or the operations structure, recruitment and replacement of people who provide sex as part of that operation is an essential business function. We know from qualitative research that victims leave operations all the time for a variety of reasons, whether they run away, rescued by police, get arrested. There's a lot of, so that there's a constant need to continually find and recruit new victims. There's very little good data on what the cost of this is to operations, like concrete data, but the evidence is suggesting that it's actually not very, it's not much of a cost for the operation itself. You know, it can be as much as providing a place to stay, some clothes, McDonald's food or whatever. So it's not a super expensive element of what the operation is doing. So as I was mentioning with Sudeep's question, really thinking about what's the best way to disrupt recruitment. Right now, the majority of what we are doing is victim level interventions. But does this paradoxically increase the net number of victims, right? So there's some questions we can ask about this that the OR math modeling side can really help us answer. You can go to the next slide, which is you.
Okay.
I'm gonna mute.
Okay, so what we're gonna walk through is just kind of a generalization of an interdiction problem that will hopefully explain why this kind of victim level kind of removing victims from the trafficking network kind of doesn't necessarily have as large of an impact as we would expect if we still haven't done anything to disrupt recruitment. So we're not necessarily specifically modeling recruitment yet. That's kind of more of a long-term goal, but I think we're going to be able to explain a couple interesting things that kind of Lauren already kind of knew before seeing the model, and maybe some of the people working in drug trafficking already knew before this. So kind of just a mathematical, like, talking about triangulation, we're triangulating something with, some math analysis and some OR analysis. So we're going to focus on interdiction problems. A lot of you probably understand what the max flow network interdiction problem is. It's played over a network. An attacker changes the network in some way. A defender then is going to move flow through the remaining network, and the defender wants to maximize its flow while the attacker seeks to minimize the max. And the study that we're going to look at, or the change, is just a very subtle change where before the defender flows or operates their network, they're going to restructure it based on the attacker's interdiction. So basically, this is a way to try to move towards a more dynamic interdiction game without kind of maybe modeling a fully dynamic game. So, the defender is going to react and then flow. And this is related to, some of the dynamic network interdiction that has gone on both at Florida and at Clemson. So, I mean, I think there's a law that somewhere in the Clemson books that if you say interdiction, you have to say Cole Smith's name. So I've satisfied that now. So what we're going to kind of the subtlety that we're going to have to do in terms of modeling these the sex trafficking networks is when we say something is flowing, what does that mean? And it's easy if we're kind of doing a money network, it's easy, the money is the flow. The drugs are the flow. But for sex trafficking, it's harder to kind of figure out what are we using the term flow to denote. And I think we've had a lot of conversations as a team, and I still don't, I think we're happy with this current kind of model, but I think there are other ways to interpret this or model things using flow. So we're going to focus on situations where flow is meant to model control. So traffickers have a certain number of victims they are willing to kind of control at any one time. And then if we have flow moving from a trafficker to a victim, that means that trafficker is exploiting that particular victim. And so, this is kind of the current example operations of a sex trafficking network. In reality, there's also a number of different options that can occur if the sex trafficking network is disrupted or intervened in some way. So, we talked a little bit about the different ways recruitment can occur. So there's always kind of a pool of people that a trafficker can turn to try and recruit if necessary. And what we're going to kind of look at is when we try and do an interdiction and change the network, the traffickers are going to react to that interdiction. So in this case, we can, if we remove victim 1 and 6 from the trafficking situation, the network is going to react in a way where the trafficker 1 and trafficker 2 are going to reach out to the recruitment, the possible recruits, and then bring them into the trafficking environment. So overall, even though we removed 1 and 6 from their trafficking situation, we haven't decreased the overall victimization in this example. And what I kind of want to walk through now is in a kind of a more mathematical example where we're going to see that when we consider kind of this restructuring, if we're not careful, interdictions can actually increase the max flow in the network. So to kind of simplify everything, since we're thinking about kind of people and nodes are people and disrupting a network, a criminal network is removing people from it. All of the nodes here are labeled with their capacity in parentheses, and the current flow through them is outside of the parentheses. And it wouldn't be difficult, any node we can convert into a node in two nodes in an arc if we wanted to focus on arc flows. And also, since this is a tree, we can just kind of assume that all of the arcs into a particular node are actually the ones with the capacity and the flow, just so that we kind of are viewing this kind of in the classic max flow min cut perspective. And what we're going to kind of assume is that restructuring is allowed from any blue node to any gray node if a gray node adjacent to the blue node's interdicted. And what I want to highlight here is kind of where does the min cut currently occur in the network. And we see that kind of the left blue node and the right blue node are both saturated. And then the two gray nodes in the middle with capacity 4 are both saturated as well. So let's see what happens if we're going to just interdict one gray node. And again, the restructuring any blue node to any gray node is feasible, a feasible reaction. So let's say we interdict or disrupt or remove the node that's highlighted with the red X. The trafficker or the blue node that it is adjacent to is going to react, and it's actually going to restructure and create an arc from it to a node on the right that currently has 0 flow into it. And so kind of re-updating what the flows would look like, we actually now, instead of kind of flowing only 8 through the center blue node, we end up flowing 11 through the center blue node, because essentially you've connected it to a node that has a capacity of 7 for the flow. And I think the critical aspect and why I continue to include the min cut drawn up here is the restructuring crossed the min cut. So we took something out of the min cut and then we added something, a new arc that crosses the min cut. And so kind of counterintuitively, because we allowed the network to react in a way that changes the set of arcs in the min cut, we've actually increased the max flow in this particular example. So kind of thinking of this mathematically, we can prove situations in terms of when we can guarantee that our interdictions will not increase the flow of the flow within the network. So in this case, kind of put simply, I mean, the math is kind of shown, but put simply, it's as long as I don't perform an interdiction that allows the defender to restructure across the min cut, then I at least won't increase the flow. I may not decrease it as much as I think, but I at least won't increase it. And typically what happens in sex trafficking networks is the min cut is going to be composed of arcs between traffickers and victims. So if we remove a victim from the trafficking situation, then ultimately the reaction is of the trafficker will cross the min cut. So we don't satisfy the properties of that theorem. We may make things worse than they were originally. So what this kind of motivates is we need to disrupt recruitment simultaneously as we're removing victims from their trafficking environment as well. A little bit more detail on some of the mathematics. From a drug trafficking network perspective, a lot of it's been shown that drug trafficking networks are essentially the min cut occurs at the dealer user level. So this is basically saying that focusing on interventions of dealers and users are really not going to decrease the overall prevalence of drugs. More from the mathematics.
We had a question in the chat that I think was for your previous slide. And I'll just to say, what you're saying rings true, because if recruitment is about structural inequalities, and unless we solve poverty and racism, it's going to be hard to stop this recruitment problem. So the question in the chat is, so the network was not necessarily optimal in terms of restructuring, in quotes, possibility, like maximizing the flow does not necessarily optimize the criminal's profit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question and good observation, because I mean, essentially it's like, why wasn't this red dash arc already in the network beforehand? And I think thinking about it from kind of a criminal perspective, I mean, there may be reasons why the center blue node was fine with 8 units of flow. I mean, if the center blue node and the one of the other blue nodes are competing, it may not be worth trying to pick up that extra demand from kind of a individual perspective. So what we're kind of saying is that the blue node was happy with 8, but now if it drops down to 4, it's willing to risk it to kind of maybe annoy the blue node on the right and restructure. So it is a really good point in terms of, it's almost like we have the status quo of the network and we're shaking it, and will it then react to the shaking, and why wouldn't it do it beforehand?
I also want to note that we have 2 minutes before our presentation is done. So I don't know where we're at with all of the beautiful stuff that was at the end of this presentation.
I'll do 30 seconds. So the one thing I wanted to do on this slide was just show what would happen if we take a standard max flow interdiction problem. So that is kind of the blue dots here, is if you only viewed it as what will the flow look like in a standard max flow network problem. And then the red is what happens if you then allow the network to react after those interdictions. So summary here is, you may not have the impact that there may be significant gaps in terms of the impact that you say you will have with this set of interdictions and what you actually will have if you're not kind of modeling the reaction of the network. So kind of conclusions and future work. Lauren, did you want to do this one?
Keep going,
okay.
Unless you want me to.
So I think, what we were hoping to kind of give you the flavor of was not necessarily a deep dive into the OR or a deep dive into the qualitative research, but the fact that we have this transdisciplinary approach that allows us to collect data, kind of verify assumptions and build models. And this type of approach took a lot of time, but that time that we invested really allowed us to build the trust between the different disciplines and the trust with our advisory group. And actually where we are now, Lauren said earlier that we're wrapping up a pilot study But based on some of the suggestions by the advisory group, we've laid out kind of a research agenda that was, I'd like to say like survivor driven, that we're kind of incorporating a lot of research questions based on what they've asked us to look at in terms of both recruitment and in terms of disruption, especially in terms of operations. You know, they've emphasized that typically sex trafficking is one piece of a larger set of criminal activities that victims are forced into. So victims may traffic in drugs, may be forced to steal, you know, commit identity theft, etc. So kind of our future work building off of this will kind of focus on disrupting recruitment networks, and then actually really focusing on how to disrupt the operations of the sex trafficking networks.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think we're a minute over, but this was really fun. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share our project. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And I think we did a pretty good job going back and forth too. Not to toot our own horn, but I was happy with it. So that's, yeah, I guess, what matters. But I do think if people have to run, feel free to hop off, but Laura and I can definitely stick around.
Yep.
I have a couple extra minutes to stick around. And
I do too. So let's draw a line. If anybody needs to leave, thank you very much. We very much appreciate your time. If you have additional questions, feel free to hang out, and maybe we can stop sharing screen and see if anybody has questions, or you can just pop them in the chat. Or we can leave the screen up. It doesn't matter. Are there any questions from anyone who wants to hang around for a couple minutes?
I have a question for Lauren. So in terms of your qualitative research, not necessarily with this specific project, but you said 10 to 15 years you've been doing interviews. Have you ever had a chance to speak to maybe any former traffickers, anybody on the dark side?
That's a very good question. I have, but not intentionally. I'll just say that. But for our future work, we will be interviewing individuals who've been convicted of trafficking and who are currently in prison. So Kelly Barrick on our team, she's a criminologist, and she works with Research Triangle Institute, RTI International. They have a lot of experience interviewing people in correctional facilities. So Kelly and I will be teaming up to do those interviews. We think that's a really important source of information for obvious reasons. My work has been built on working with individuals who provide sex. So people involved in sex trading, victims, survivors of trafficking, and sex workers, and sort of understanding the transactional sex from sort of more that viewpoint. So it'll be an interesting challenge, but I think for this project, very important. And we do have a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Tom.
Yeah.
What recommendations do you have for other researchers that are dealing with lack of data on illegal activities?
So I think it's a hard question. Other approaches that I've done in my own work. So I had done, before Laura and I kind of started on this team, I had worked on interdicting drug trafficking networks. And I started with that by doing some very, very basic interviews and just trying to get, you know, ranges of data. So, you know, I think we've done a deep dive into actually getting data on real cases. But I think from kind of early models, just simply understanding ranges of data. So like things like how many users in a crack cocaine supply chain does a dealer typically sell to? How many dealers does a user know of? So those types of ranges can help you at least generate a network that has that looks like what people think it would. So you can dive into some more kind of the criminology literature, if if possible. But it's hard. I mean, and I think everything's just starting now with kind of, especially from the OR perspective. So I think the data questions is something that people will continue to come back to. And I also think I saw someone raise their hand. So
can I say something real quick while you're looking for the raised hand on that question?
Yep.
I think one of the things that I've really valued about this team that we have on this project is patience. You know, being open to not knowing yet what the data is, and not rushing to make models and math stuff just to get to that point. Just being very patient and building it step by step, and really involving people in the conceptualization of the problem who have lived experience. If there's anything I've learned in my, I don't know, 15, 16 years of research, is that people with lived experience are experts and they are super smart. And we are stupid if we don't, meaning we in academia, are stupid if we don't include them in the conceptualization of the research that we do. Sorry if I'm calling people stupid, I don't mean to do that, but I just think it's really important. It's an important source of information, and also an important wisdom and expertise. So I appreciate our team a lot. And I think for any illegal activity that is just, you know, you have to take time to get to know the issue and the people involved. Did somebody have a raised hand?
yeah, so I think.
Hi, that's me. Thank you so much for the presentation. I actually have two questions, one on the modeling perspective. So I can see that I think when an arc is disrupted, the capacity of the arc is reduced to 0. Do we consider the case where it's partially reduced?
That's an easy question. We haven't yet.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And the second question I have is regarding the nature of disrupting an arc. How does that look in a realistic scenario?
So the arc disruptions, I mean, we actually don't necessarily focus on disrupting any of what you would consider arcs when we're looking at the nodes as actual criminals. We would expand the set of arcs just because notationally it's easier, and then constrain the set of interdictions to only be the arcs that represent the node expansions. So really we're doing kind of entirely node-based disruptions right now.
I see. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? I also just want to say, I in no way mean to, I'm feeling bad about saying that we're stupid in academia. I think we lose if we don't include people with lived experience. We lose valuable insight, would be more how I would frame it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I think when you start working in these spaces, I mean, I think your goal is to help, right? And if you're not incorporating their experiences, you're telling them how we should help you, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and it may be helpful, it just might not, and it might be harmful. So that's, yeah. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any questions immediately.
Well, thank you, everyone. And feel free, to reach out through email with questions if you have them as well. Thank you, Lauren, again, on behalf of Clemson. It was really educational. And so we appreciate your time.
Thank you. No, this was fun. And I appreciate the questions that were asked. It helps us do our work better when people ask us questions. So that's awesome. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a good day, everybody. Do you want me to hang for a second, Tom?
Sure, just in case anyone
Yeah.
does it, and just to debrief.
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to stop.